welcome back to the Tea and a Butty podcast. I'm Dominic.
And I'm Erica.
And today's episode, we're going to be talking about how the war left its mark on Britain.
Right.
And
is it just going to be World War II or, like, sort of both wars?
Both wars, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, you know.
Both wars. Like, there's only been two wars.
There's only both, yeah. I mean, both world wars.
World wars.
Yes. World War One is still talked about, today, with the Remembrance Sunday. And I don't think there's too much of I don't think over here there's an equivalent of that, the 11th.
Yeah, it's, is it?
Because Memorial Day is something different. Veterans Day, that's it. That's the one.
Yeah.
It's Remembrance Sunday in the UK, where at the 11th hour of the 11th, day of the 11th month, it's a minute's silence, and, the monarch, it'll be King Charles now, lays a wreath at the cenotaph in Whitehall, and everybody, remembers. People wear poppies.
Yeah.
Because of Flanders Field in Belgium.
I mean, Americans did fight in World War One.
Oh, yeah, no, they did.
But again, it was like, I think we entered late.
Well, it was an entry that was, because the Russians had pulled out of the war, and they were fighting on the Allies' side against Germany and Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, I think it was. Maybe it wasn't the Ottoman Empire. Austro-Hungary.
You're looking at me for clarification.
Yeah, because I mean,
really don't. I'm not up on my World War One history very much.
But they entered, and it was like, yes, the World War and stuff, and it ended like maybe a year later.
Yeah.
Whereas in World War II, again, it was like a case of there was an isolation movement.
Yeah.
In the years between, where America was like, we're not going to form any European alliances or do any deals over there. If any war breaks out, we're just going to keep out of it, know, and just kind of keep to ourselves, grow our defenses and all this.
Yeah.
But of course, when the Nazi threat started up, Britain was seriously in need of and the whole Lend-Lease agreement. That's a whole episode on its own, really, the Lend-Lease agreement. But Neutrality Act, and no American citizen could be drafted or pulled in, so if you were an American in London during the war breakout and someone goes, you've got to be out there fighting, it's like, nope,
I'm American.
I'm an American. I'm neutral,
Gosh, yeah. I'm sure many of them just joined up, though, out of...
Yeah, no, there was a lot of people who could join up, and they could join because Canada had declared war like a week.
That's interesting.
A week later.
I never thought about Americans who were living in Britain at the time that war broke out,
Yeah, because I'm sure as journalists or, whoever was in London, to report the news were exempt from it, obviously.
Yeah. From
any fighting or, getting involved in any way. But there was still, with Roosevelt, there was still kind of this, we've got to do something. We've got to send, because, Britain had nothing. It was bankrupt at that point.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And the rationing and everything, and that's another thing, the rationing and, the depression and everything. But yeah, because there's a lot that still remained after, because it was the Blitz and the threat of invasion and, being that close to it, know. It was more kind of an extreme and intense situation.
Well, yeah, so it makes sense that there are a lot of...
the effects, which are only just now kind of starting to wear off in the UK, really.
Yeah.
Because, that generation, by the turn of the 1999 to 2000, the generation who fought in the war and survived were dying off. Old age and whatever.
But I mean, even then... I think that the war and wartime, life is still just so ingrained. Even young people in Britain now, know probably a lot more about it than.
I mean, that's an interesting poll they should conduct. YouGov keeps sending me these polls about or polls on thing. They should say, oh, how much does people under 25 know about the war? Yeah.
I mean, that's the whole point of this podcast. Like, what still lingers, and what has just become part of everyday kind of culture over there, because it just can't be the same over here, because like you said, the proximity to where the action was happening.
Yes, I mean, it never directly affected, I suppose it would have directly affected people who had people in the military, family in the military, who went over there like you.
Yeah.
And, so that the war was thing, but if it was a case of like, oh yeah,
as far as everyday life, I mean, I've never been to Hawaii, but maybe there are like things that you see in everyday life that remind you of the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
If you live over there, but in mainland America, nothing. Nothing.
I mean, nothing because
there was no action over here,
Because, I grew up I was born in the mid-1980s, so I grew up well after the war had ended. Everything was back to World War II had ended, and everything was back to normal. It was peacetime, I guess you could call it.
Yeah.
But, I grew up with, like, shows on TV like Dad's Army, which was a comedy about, the Home Guard during the war.
Yeah.
And, I'd occasionally ask my dad, it's like, oh, did we have any? Oh, yeah, your grandfather was in the Navy during the war. Mm-hmm. And he saw action at some place or whatever,
Right, yeah.
But he became a policeman in the when he left the army and stuff, at the Navy. And I think, of course, my grandmother was a nurse during the war,
Yeah.
She never went overseas, but she was a nurse during the whole, thing, the whole, like, Battle of Britain, the Blitz and everything,
Yeah.
And the Blitz is something that everybody talked about. There were still people living in Britain, as you didn't have to be in the military. They were all codgers or whatever. They were like, oh, my Ernie died in the Blitz.
Yeah.
I went out shopping one morning and came home and the whole place was in rubble and he was gone.
Yeah.
And it's like, and then of course there was people who were like, oh yeah, I was evacuated as a kid.
Everybody's grandparents had some sort of story, like,
And, some of them was like, oh, I was evacuated as a kid. I was born in the late 30s, and then I was evacuated to the countryside from London or wherever, one of the big cities, which Operation Pied Piper was,
But that's something else we never really even had in America. Just even TV shows that were like
Hogan's Heroes.
Hogan's Heroes.
That's one thing I hear about.
I think that's the only. Like,
MASH was about the Korean War.
Yeah, I think Hogan's Heroes might have been the only TV show. Of course, there's billions and billions of films,
movies, yes,
in the war.
Yeah, like there was a lot of like, The Longest Day, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but those are not necessarily,
and it's usually
just
about
Americans, or usually about what?
Usually about the Normandy landings.
Yes, but they're. Well, I guess you could say that might be geared toward Americans, obviously, because that happened just after America arrived in the war.
Yeah, about 1942 was when America, because in December 1941 was when Pearl Harbor happened and they declared war on the Japanese, and then Germany and Italy declared war on America. So in 1942, that's when the army was mobilized, the air force was mobilized, and the navy and whatever. And it was like across the sea to the UK, and then
yeah,
we have to stop. We have to we have to invade France. So and that's part of the kind of like lingering effects, because you watch like shows like Dad's Army and and like Goodnight Sweetheart and stuff, and they kind of follow the events of like the rationing and the Blitz, and sheltering in the underground.
Yeah.
And in some of these underground like stations that have been abandoned for years, there's still like wartime posters.
But that was my point. You know, we don't have any sort of like, or we never had any sort of TV show that was like about America during the war, you know, because it was like life over here was sort of the same, you know. I
mean, there was some rationing.
You know, women had to go into the workforce again, you know, like in Britain, because men were gone, and it sounds weird to say women had to...
Rosie the Riveter, and all that kind of stuff. They had to do a man's job, as they say, you know.
Yeah.
It's like they weren't just, you know, at home with the children.
But there's no sort of like, there weren't really quite as strong. And, you know, this may be just because of this may be my generation talking. Like if we had an older person, if my grandmother was still here, maybe she would say, oh yes, it was different. It was a lot different during the war than,
I mean, at a different time, yeah. I mean,
you know, to her, it might have seemed, oh, that life did change a lot, you know, but not as much anyway as it did in Britain, obviously.
No, I think there was a lot more like scarcity, you know, with the rationing and just the general depression and the bombing didn't help. That, I mean, the Blitz was only really from 1940. There was 9 months really that the most happened.
Yeah,
and you know the landscape, and there was a couple I read about when I'm doing my research. The grandchildren of an old ARP warden, an air raid protection officer, who used to go around warning of the air raids and then mapping the damage after it had happened.
Yeah, just explain that really quickly. You just did, but a little bit. An air raid? More. Yeah, because we don't know what that is.
An air raid that was like air raid precaution or air raid patrolman. Mm-hmm. There were these like
older.
They were kind of older people or people who couldn't serve in the actual military. Yeah. They were issued with a tin hat with ARP on it.
like the tin hat was gonna do anything.
Well, it's like the old tin hat from like World War One.
Yeah.
Which didn't, you know, like, and it was kind of like white with a black stripe, and they had authority, you know. Yeah. They had a torch and they had like a gas mask. Everybody was required to carry a gas mask in Britain because there was a threat of a gas attack.
Yeah.
They were like, oh, the Germans are coming over, they're going to drop gas, and, you know.
Yeah.
You know, we'll all be knocked out, and then that'll be the end of it, you know.
Yeah.
And they came round, and they would come round and go, there's going to be, you know, you've got to put that light out.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't show lights in a blackout during an air raid.
But they would also literally stand up on the roofs of the buildings.
They'd stand up on the roofs of the buildings, maybe with...
watching for planes, right?
Watching for planes, you know, with searchlights. And they'd also be on, like, fire duty. And they'd rope some civilians into it, too, which was a bucket of sand. And it's like, if they dropped an incendiary bomb, which is what bombed out the bombed out church in Liverpool. That's what bombed it out, was an incendiary device.
Oh, yeah.
And if it was like, whoosh, you know, you had to put sand over it to, like, you know, so it didn't catch fire or whatever. Snuff it out.
Yeah.
And, you know, when that's going on, you know, you could be hit by a bomb, you know, you get hit by an actual bomb or whatever, you know. But it's like these are just, like, cinders being dropped from, like, far off explosions.
And these are people, I mean, did they go through any training?
I mean, you know, compared to, like, today's kind of, like, intensive training courses for, like, thing, they were just told by a government official or an army or a firefighter what to do.
Yeah.
And that was it.
And it's just like, okay, while everyone else is supposed to be seeking shelter and, you know, going down into bomb cellars and stuff, they're up on the roof.
They had, like, authority to, like, fine civilians who were skirting the blackout rules, you know, by keeping lights on or whatever, or opening the window or whatever. Yeah. And they also knew from, like, you know, because when an air raid was going to happen, the Germans are coming over tonight, so got to prepare people, and, you know, everyone get evacuated. That always just trips me out. People will just be like, well, I'm not going, they can blow me up, I don't care, you know. And eventually they might or they mightn't, it's like, it was...
It's reminiscent of people over here who, when a hurricane is coming, say, well, I'll be fine. I'm just going to stay here. I'm not going to evacuate,
Yeah, and I mean, that kind of stuff, all that kind of stuff was like, everybody was like preparing for invasion at that point. Mm-hmm. Because, like, just before the war was declared, the kids were evacuated.
Yeah.
But... because they were like, oh, there's air raids going to happen,
right.
imminent. And then war was declared. The air raids didn't really happen for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So they were like, oh, well, the kids can come back then.
Yeah.
And people were like, and some people were like, no, leave them where they are. The government were seriously going, no, and they'd have like propaganda posters of Hitler going, take them back, to the mothers who were like, oh, I want my kid back,
Yeah.
But the government were like, no, just, hang on.
Mm-hmm.
But some of them would come back and, the air raid started and then they were like, okay, get them out of here, back to the country. And so, there was like Operation Pied Piper where they, these kids were just like, shipped off on a train and with the little tag saying, their names and addresses and their little thing.
So that brings us to another way that Britain still
remembers the war. As if you've ever seen Paddington or read the Paddington books, like he comes to, and you'd think, oh, it's just an immigrant thing, it's just like she's packed him off from Peru.
Yeah.
Deepest, darkest Peru.
Or it's just some kind of cutesy little element of the story, you know, whoever had him is just like got a little thing that says, oh, take care of this bear, whatever.
But it was Michael Bond who wrote the stories, saw like photographs of all these kids in train stations with little battered suitcases and coats on with labels around their necks with their names and addresses or where they'd come from.
Yeah, and they looked like little city, they
little city
little
boys.
Boots and
oh yeah, and that's another thing. Like people who were taking in these kids were shocked at their diet.
Oh,
they had such a poor diet, and because out in the country it was kind of like things were a little bit better because you had access to farms, so you had fresh milk, you had fresh eggs, and you had like you could be near a mill where the fresh bread, whereas like in the cities it was like all this stuff had to be imported in, and it was kind of like no, there's no room for that, it's got to go to the war effort. So you're rationed on everything. Chocolate and everything.
Yeah. So it's just so funny,
Yeah.
how people may or may not know that that's where the little element of
Paddington came from. Yeah.
It's just interesting. Again, probably the first time I ever read or saw the Chronicles of Narnia, the same thing. They had little. Oh,
because that's the thing. When you read about Operation Pied Piper, you're like, in popular culture, there's like a ton of like books and films that have been kind of like that's a main theme of it.
And when you're a kid and you're reading this story or whatever, you don't think that's an element. Again,
that someone's made that up.
It's like an element of the story. Oh, they sent their kids off to go.
Who did that? Honestly,
to go live with strangers or like distant relatives or whatever, people that they don't even know, and so they had to have a little tag on them saying who they were, or, like sort of like limo drivers picking up a passenger at the airport. It's just like you're going with strangers.
Yeah, it was just like their schools would be packed off onto a train, and they didn't know. It was just like they were being collected by a stranger at the train station at the other end and taken to a home that they didn't know.
Yeah.
And, some of them had great lives. They stayed there from 5 years, which is an eternity for a child. So when the war was over and they were like, okay, it's time to go home now. Your parents are still alive.
Yeah.
So, they go back and they'd be like, oh, I don't know who you are. This is weird,
So other things in, popular culture or just, carrying on in everyday life that is a reminder of the war or wartime.
Yeah.
Is some of the propaganda.
The propaganda,
stuff.
like if the invader comes, they'd send out these leaflets that say, like, if the invader comes, this is what to do and when to do it.
Yeah.
And, some people would, like, go, oh, no, I don't really like this, so it's too...
But, I mean, do they still...
They still kind of, like, have,
They put that out sometimes, or, like...
I mean, during the pandemic, apparently the government resorted to...
Oh, yeah.
Doing that again, If the coronavirus comes, stay in your house, do this, it was like, oh, it's very wartime, and people were like, oh, this is worse than the Blitz.
The most popular example, of course, is the Keep Calm and Carry On campaign. Which was
never, that was never actually implemented. That was only going to be implemented if the Germans had actually invaded.
Yeah, that's
if the Germans had actually invaded, that would be like, okay, just put up these things, keep calm, carry on, keep calm,
Yeah. And so how did that creep into popular culture?
Someone found it in an office.
I would say, about 15 years ago?
Yeah.
It started to spring up, like...
Someone found it in an office, in the back of an office, and thought, oh, it looks pretty cool with the crown and everything, the original poster.
Yeah.
And it was like an old, whatever. And someone, I don't know if the UK government still owned the copyright on it or whatever, this guy just took it and started printing it out.
Yeah.
On everything. Mugs, making it merch, It
was
and it became like, basically making it a merch item.
Mm-hmm.
And, it just, like, everybody was like, oh, yes, I love that. It's a very British thing. And, Anglophiles were, like, lapping it up over here.
Oh, God.
And then it became, like, keep calm and...
Whatever.
Yeah.
No, I would say, it got so popular, like you said, it became keep calm and whatever.
Yeah.
I think kind of worldwide. And I would venture to guess that the majority of people have absolutely no idea.
Absolutely no idea about the origin of it. Yeah, because I think the Welsh band, the Stereophonics, named their album after it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and even the poster and everything. And... I think I read up on it, and it's like, oh, the UK government were kind of like, oh, well, wait a minute, we should sue, because that's kind of technically our property.
Oh, jeez.
And people were like, nah, it's kind of like, it's in the public domain now, so this guy shouldn't actually be making money off of it, or whoever would started it up. It's become like an open source kind of thing, I think. But I might be wrong on that. You'll have to do further research on if someone's claimed it as their own.
But basically it was a campaign that they were planning on using if the Germans
if the Nazis had
invaded.
Come, yeah. Had gained a foothold in...
Nazis,
yes, Nazis have Germans. I mean, the German army had, occupied the UK.
Right.
The Nazis occupied the UK.
I mean, what made them think, though, that the Nazis were going to allow... Keep calm and carry on posters to go
There would have been a resistance movement. Yeah, I mean, they were planning all this because what happened in the war, they thought, oh, well, the Germans are rolling out and, the British Expeditionary Force and the Dunkirk evacuation had happened and all the kids were like, oh, we're never going to win this war. They are so powerful and mighty and they've invaded Poland and they've taken all of France. And even, like, the US generals were like, oh, well, that's it. Even the US ambassador was like, oh, that's it, Britain's doomed, you know?
Yeah.
It's like the Germans are going to take over,
and
right
the
there, Nazis are,
and they had everything else.
Nazis came in, and with the fall of France, it was like, Britain's going to surrender now, because it's not, it's not looking good,
Yeah.
And it wasn't looking good because it was down to the Royal Air Force who, the Battle of Britain, which effectively kind of like stopped the invasion. From happening. But before that, they were putting up all the anti-invasion stuff they can. And as I've personally seen all the effects of that, like the dragon's teeth and the pillboxes and, like random stones in a field.
Yeah.
You're like, what was that? Was that a house or what was that? And it's just like a random block in like at the edge of a field. And someone will go, well, that was an anti-tank stone that they just never removed.
Oh yeah.
And the dragon's teeth on the coasts of like Wales and stuff would just look like pyramidal thing to like to channel tanks where they can like blow them up, And the pillboxes, there was one on the on the Pembrey Country Park coast that I always thought, oh, that's why would someone have built this? But I was like, oh, it's a wartime thing, that someone can go in, it's like a machine gun.
Yeah.
Coastal defenses, And I mean, there's loads of them, everywhere you're going to go, you'd think like, you have to think like, oh, there's a random something there. And why would that be there? That doesn't make any logical sense. And then you're thinking, oh, it's probably some kind of like something from the war, so it's still there.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff that's still kind of like there. And
that still exists just like in everyday life, just as
you're
walking around.
You never think about is like on some London estates, there's like this black mesh railings.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, they're just fences.
Mm-hmm.
They were stretchers used in the war during the Blitz.
In London?
In London, yeah.
That's...
They were, and they've still got the kinks in them, so they can be lifted up easily. It seems a bit morbid.
Yeah.
But there was such a big, huge surplus of them.
What were they going to do with them?
Yeah, after the war, were they going to melt them down? They could have reused them, obviously, but then they did. They made like fences to like go around these estates and stuff to make boundaries.
But they didn't.
They just welded them all together.
Yeah, I was going to say, but they didn't melt them down to make them look like.
No, they just welded them together and painted them black. And I'm presuming they weren't black to begin with.
Yeah.
But you can tell that's what they were.
We've only seen pictures of this, by the way. I think it would be interesting to go and see them in real life when next we go to London, and we'll definitely post pictures and stuff if we're able to do that. But yeah, that's very crazy to me.
They were originally emergency stretchers used by the ARP people, because they had the thankless job of going around surveying the damage, and also they were the first responders to anyone who'd been blown up by a bomb.
Yeah.
In a rubble. So it's kind of grim, and it's like, someone might just be injured,
Mm-hmm.
So they put them on these stretchers, and they had the like little grooves that kept them a little bit off the thing so they could be picked up easily. Yeah. And they still have them on the fences.
It's very eerie, I would say.
Eerie and grim, and it was, and it's no wonder when, like American servicemen came over from like America, living normal life, even in a small town that was kind of poor from the Great Depression or whatever.
Yeah.
Going to a place like Britain must have been like, oh, the place that they don't have any food, teeth, and missing, and the kids have no shoes because, everything, and it's just rubble everywhere, and it's grim, and it's always raining. It's like, it's no wonder the stereotype, like, grew up, sprung up, and, it's like, oh, it's terrible over there. They've got nothing. It's a third world country,
But then you look at it from a completely different angle, and it's like, they didn't end up in the garbage. They were reused. They repurposed them. It was very anti-waste.
Very anti-waste. It was very recyclable. Yeah. Recyclable.
Yeah, I mean, it seems a bit, but it's kind of for the better good in the long run, I
mean, looking at them, they're not like, oh, those are wartime stretchers. You'd have to know, you know.
Yeah.
When you see them and go, oh yeah, the mesh fences. They just look like fences.
And it's like kind
in a concrete
crazy
post,
little like
cultural oddity,
secret or something, like.
Yeah, and it's so much like that in like places like London. I mean.
Well, you went before you keep going. You briefly mentioned that church that we do have a photograph of in Liverpool.
Yeah, the bombed out church.
And again, it's like an eerie, it's like a ghost church. It
stands to like memorialize the war, and the people who died in it.
It's literally, I don't know if any of you have ever seen a picture of it. I had not before I visited Liverpool. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. But it looks like something out of like Dracula or something because it's just the frame, just the outside frame, of the church, basically.
The roof was hit by an incendiary device and it burned up. Yeah. And, the black and everything is still there. It hasn't been cleaned and, You know, it's and
it's
the
ancient.
church in
Do you know? It's very like Gothic looking to me on the outside, anyway. And so you're looking at it. It's close to downtown. It's like in the middle of Liverpool.
Yeah.
You walk up on it, and it's just this literal ghost of a church. I mean, you're looking at it, and you can see through the windows into what would have been the inside of the church, and then
it's
through
just like
to
a
the
frame,
through to the other side, and see the window on the other side, and then just daylight streaming all the way through, sky, whatever, you know, because there's nothing.
Yeah, and they've just left it as it is, as a, you know, reminder of it. And, you know, there's some...
I don't think you can't go in or anything, right? I mean,
I think you can go up to it.
Yeah, so it must be... They must... It must be sturdy enough that there's no sort of, like, threat of it falling over.
Yeah, no, it's like... It's...
I mean, I suppose there's ruins like that all over Britain, too, you know? And technically, I guess that's a ruin now as well. But just for, not because of time itself, but...
It's quite, well, I mean, I say it's quite new. It says here 1811 and 1832.
Is when it was built?
Yeah, between...
Oh, really?
So it was quite new.
It was in some sort of...
only about 100 years old.
Okay, so he just looked it up, obviously, because we didn't know that 5 seconds ago, but, yeah, does it say what style it's in? Because... I don't know. It looks very Gothic to me. It does not look like it. Yeah,
it's quite Gothic looking. Yeah,
I would not have assumed it was
the architecture anyway.
Built that recently.
So it's an Anglican church, you know.
Yeah, it's beautiful though. And were you able to find in your research if there are any other buildings? I know most of the ones in London. We'll get back to London now. I know you started.
The Victoria and Albert Museum has like pockmarks of like bomb blast.
Okay.
And there's a lot of places in London, like, you know, like where there's buildings missing.
Yeah.
You know, and they just haven't rebuilt there, you know.
Okay, yeah.
And it's like those were obviously hit by a... And there was this brother and sister team that went around photographing all the places that, you know, were bombed out during the war and are now like...
Like recently, though.
Recently, in about 2015, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And that they're still there, you know, that they haven't developed. Because, you know, sometimes... There was whole, like, estates and houses and stuff, and then just decided, oh, well, we'll just put up, in the 60s, you know, we'll just put up a huge big block of flats on it, and that'll be the end of it, you know?
Yeah.
Or we'll destroy this church because it was built in the war. And it's funny because last year in Exeter, they found an unexploded bomb. From
unexploded bombs are another
during the 90s,
modern reminder of the war.
During the 90s, that's all that seemed to come up in the news when I was a kid. It was like, oh, they found an unexploded bomb in London or Birmingham or, you know, something. And I'm like, what do you mean an unexploded bomb? And they're like, oh, something, you know, the Germans dropped tons of bombs and some of them didn't go off. And I'm like, well, that's comforting, you know, to think that there's still unexploded bombs still hanging out everywhere.
Yeah.
Because, you know, when they, like, do excavation work or whatever to build a new shopping centre or something, and the workers were always coming across, like, these... You know,
I mean, yeah, that makes the news over here.
10,000-pound shells or whatever, you know.
When there is an unexploded bomb somewhere, I've seen it on the news over here. You know, mines also in the ocean. They'll wash up like.
Sea mines.
It's just like, ugh.
Well, I've actually seen a huge limpet mine.
Oh, really?
It was washed up on the beach in Scotland. But it wasn't unexploded or anything. Everything had been taken out, but it was just still there and nobody bothered to move it.
Yeah.
And it had been there since wartime.
God, that's so, like, just...
And it was one of those spiky ones, you know, like...
Surreal.
And it looks so, like alien, you know?
Yeah.
And it just washed up and people were like, they just leave it there. And it's like, well, so it's going to explode or what? It's like, no, they've removed everything from it, you know?
Yeah. Just no point.
And then bam, you know, it's like, no, it's safe, boosh.
Yeah,
you know?
But again, these are the kinds of things that we didn't deal with in America. You know, we don't have bombed out, you know, ancient churches that are like standing somewhere.
I mean,
or, like...
there's still like marks of it everywhere, you know, like in Britain, you know. And like last year, they had this unexploded bomb in Exeter, in Devon.
Yeah.
And they did a controlled explosion of it, and they evacuated everyone, obviously. But it was such a big bomb that it structurally damaged all the houses surrounding it. And it's like, yeah, the residents would come home to the council were like, yeah, those homes are uninhabitable now.
Oh my gosh.
Because they'll have to be knocked down or something, because it's like they've structurally been damaged by the explosion. And that was a controlled one.
Goodness.
Yeah, I mean, all this kind of stuff, it was just growing up, it was just kind of like the war was like, it wasn't
over.
It wasn't over, or it wasn't that far away, even though it had been like, what, 50 years? 50 years. 50 years. That was the 60s, yeah. And I was thinking of Dad's Army and all that. That came out in the 60s, and that's when everybody started kind of like making shows about the war in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Yeah.
But, and now it's like dramas that kind of like deal with like the wartime period,
Yeah.
And...
Well, it's a little bit like, I don't know, it feels weird. It feels weird.
Like a Low was like, one of the ones
to make a comedy about the war, it's just like,
because it was kind of like Dad's Army just made fun of the Home Guard, which were like people who couldn't join up but were required to do their bit. So, anyone who was like exempt from like an ARP warden, they went into the Home Guard, and that was like to defend against invasion, and they were like old men and young boys who had gammy legs or whatever that couldn't, like, medically unfit. So it was just kind of like, and then a Low was kind of like, it was written by the same people. That was about a cafe owner in France, in occupied France, so it had like, that kind of thing. It was occupied by the Nazis and stuff, and until it was eventually liberated in the D-Day landings.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's just kind of like, those kind of things were like, made fun of the war, and Blackadder Goes Forth.
Oh yeah.
That was another one that's set during World War One.
Yeah.
In the trenches of northern France. And again, it's just like people think, it's trivializing the war, making fun of it and stuff like that, but it's actually just making its people, and I mean, if they just kind of said, okay, the war's over, forget about that was weird, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Seal all the documents, let's not talk about it ever again. It's like,
that's more disrespectful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's more different. It's way more disrespectful. Yeah,
to just like,
I mean, the war.
To me, it seems very British to make fun of, a serious situation.
Yes, because over here, I mean, the war kind of films and TV series largely portrayed the American hero,
Well, yeah.
And it was very, like, serious, and it was all...
romanticizing,
not trivializing, the Allied forces, the part that America played in liberating Europe and stuff like that. But it was very much like yes, we won the war by ourselves. And
and that's the attitude of many Americans if you talk to them.
Yeah. I mean, because I mean, it's like, you've got to look at it with a balanced perspective, and everything. Because, like, there's a lot of, like, 70,000 women in the UK became a GI bride.
Yeah.
And that's because they came over and they were earning 5 times more than the average British soldier.
Yeah.
They had all the chocolate, all the candy, all the, like, chewing gum. And, they were like, wow, to, like, people in Britain who had nothing.
Yeah.
And nylons and everything, and they organised kids' parties at the base and, and it was just kind of like, it's like, so no wonder, that happened,
Real quick before because we need to wrap it up soon, but another one that I thought of that is also World War I related is the filling of the moat around
the Tower of London.
The Tower of London with poppies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They do that. I think they do that every year.
They do. The thing about it is, I think they use that moat for different, like, art installations or different, like, exhibits type thing.
Because it used to be filled with water from the Thames, but
year round, like, so there'll be like, I think we recently saw someone on YouTube, or not recently, but we saw someone on YouTube, like, there was like a wildflower exhibit all around.
Yeah.
Really beautiful. So if you're like a tourist in London at the time of year that it's filled with poppies, you probably just think, oh, that's pretty.
It's filled with poppies, yeah.
Oh, this is a thing that they do. Or maybe it's like this all the time, you know. But if you're British, you know,
because people are wearing poppies, you know around
the reason.
around November, the presenters and news people usually, and sometimes they get picked up on it if they're not wearing. Oh, he wasn't wearing his poppy, or she wasn't wearing a poppy. Yeah, what's going on here? Yeah, there was huge, and still to this day, and it's like, pretty much everyone from World War I who could remember it is dead.
It was literally over 100 years ago.
Over 100 years ago now.
Yeah.
It ended over 100 years ago.
Yeah. So.
And it's like, that shows you how much of it it's still, because I don't know about over here if anyone would get picked up for not,
I mean, very few people wear poppies. My mom had one. She had bought one off of like a veteran or something one time. They had these little like,
because usually it's obviously like the Korean War or the Vietnam War now that's kind of like remembered in American war history.
They were raising money for something, and they were selling these little like the fake flowers, and it was one that you could hang in your car, and it was like never forget, or it had a little thing with it.
Oh yeah, I remember you telling me that.
She bought it and she donated the money or whatever, and she had it in her car for years, and she moved it to the new car when she got a new car. But other than that, like, probably before I met you, I didn't know anything about the association with poppies and
I mean, again, that was drilled. I mean, we had to wear at school. They used to, like, they'd stand outside with, like, selling poppies. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's definitely not.
And it would cost, like, a pound or 50p to buy one, and I get one, and I put it on,
Yeah. But yeah.
It wasn't a real poppy. It was like plastic kind of, like, thing, so,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think they would sell real poppies,
I mean, Britain loves to get involved in things, though. They love to have their things that they
things
do,
to get involved in.
Yeah, like the red nose day. Everybody's got to have the red noses.
Things just kind of like last. I mean, it's funny because I'm trying to think of stuff that, I mean, is kind of a bit off topic, but stuff that's that lasts over here compared to over there.
Yeah.
And I'm not really thinking of anything right now. I mean, Red Nose Day, comic relief.
Over here, meaning in America?
Yeah. That I think that may have started.
I think it's just
here.
to do with the fact that we're just so many more people. It's difficult to get everybody on board.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, because it's like what 2 billion people.
Yeah, something. Anyway. I hate to like wrap this up abrupt, but our podcast, you guys, last week was so long. I feel like we owe it to you to like get this one. It's
45 minutes, so you're still with us. Can you hear me?
But yeah, there's a lot of symbols and things that just still exist in everyday life in Britain. If you get a chance to visit, see if you can take note of all of them.
Yeah.
When you visit any of the castles that are along the coast, I mean, obviously they had...
Well, the Dover Castle was like turned into kind of like a war HQ type thing, yeah.
But I think several of them were used as like, they were reused as like...
Fortresses.
Fortresses, yeah. Like, I mean, that's what they were built for.
It's like, oh, we've got these.
Yes.
We may as well put them to use again.
And even the holes, apparently, especially at Dover Castle, like the holes that they would have fired, I don't know, what, bow and arrow out of or whatever, originally.
Or like submarine,
were used to fire the guns, across the channel and stuff.
The invasion never happened.
No.
Because there apparently was a planned invasion. I can't remember what it was called. Operation something. Hitler had planned an invasion and then scrapped it.
Yeah.
And I think if he'd launched it, I mean, everybody talks about the if he'd launched it, would he have succeeded? And, but it's kind of like, again...
Didn't they capture, like, Guernsey or something?
Oh, yeah, those were tiny. They captured Guernsey.
Yeah.
Because it was pretty
close
easy.
To France.
It was very close to France, yeah, Guernsey and Jersey. And they've got their own, like, Liberation Day holiday.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah.
But it's like that's the only part of Britain that was ever captured, and that's kind of like interesting history because my dad went over there for like I think he went to like Guernsey or maybe it was Jersey, I can't remember now. But he brought back these things that he'd gone on like, at a museum there. They were kind of like prisoner camp cards and stuff.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Because they would have just taken the island prisoner,
Maybe that's another
occupied the island
topic altogether.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, what's this? And it's like, oh yeah, it's something I picked up at,
Yeah.
So, that was another interesting aspect.
It's another interesting story, definitely. If you guys have ever seen or have never seen, what is it, the Guernsey Literary...
Potato Peel Society?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's because that's set during the occupation of...
Yeah, you should check that out.
Yeah, that's a nice film.
It's
a lovely film for you to watch. You love it.
Anyway, thank you guys so much as always for tuning in. We really appreciate your support. If you don't follow us already on social media, be sure to check us out over there. We are at TButty, TEABUTTY on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And we'll talk to you next time.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.